You're listening to the Stoic Solutions Podcast, practical wisdom for everyday life inspired by ancient philosophers of Greece and Rome. I'm your host, Justin Vacula. Visit my website at stoicsolutionspodcast.com. This is episode 95, Kai Whiting on vegetarian and vegan eating. Kai is a researcher and lecturer in sustainability and Stoic philosophy based at UC Louvain in Belgium. He tweets at Kai Whiting, that's KAIWHITING, and blogs at stoickai.com. His newest paper is titled, How Might a Stoic Eat in Accordance with Nature and Environmental Facts? We last met at Stoicon 2019 and continue our conversation today. On with the episode. All right, welcome back to the show, Kai. Now talking about your newest paper, How Might a Stoic Eat in Accordance with Nature and Environmental Facts? Welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
We're recording at the end of July. We last met in person in Athens, Greece for Stoicon 2019, and now travel is mostly at a standstill.
Absolutely, even here, we've been in lockdown twice. We've had 2 episodes now here in Portugal because we decided to open everything up at the same time and then wondered why that was a bit of a challenge to maybe the health system. So yeah, even in Europe, it's a bit different, a bit difficult.
But much unlike the ancient Stoics, we're still able to keep going and connect here over Zoom as we're using today, and you're still publishing online. So what led you to write your new paper?
I think that people have a misunderstanding sometimes because of the prevalence of certain, I would say, types of Stoicism or certain interests in the Stoic community, that the most basic things that we can do in life, like eat and buy clothing or travel from one place to another within our locality, is something that's not particularly important to Stoicism because it's about, I don't know, business sense or the bigger picture or some kind of how do I become a better person? And we see it in a very sort of zoomed out way. Like, how do I make either we go to nothing is in my control, I can't do anything, or let's make the world a better place and think about it from a communal perspective. And actually, the Stoics were very, very interested in what we do on a day-to-day basis. Like, they wanted consistency and coherence. And we consistently eat, like most of us, I would say, not all of us, but most of us in the Western world eat between 2 to 3 times a day. Some of us eat maybe 4 or 5 because we like smaller meals. So it's strange that there was like this sort of hole I felt in the contemporary Stoic movement where nobody really went into depth about what one should eat, even though we literally decide 3 times a day what we're going to eat and what we're going to buy. So particularly at the moment in a COVID-19 scenario, most of our money in the West is going on food because a lot of our entertainment has just, as you said, we have to entertain ourselves. We not really can go out anywhere. So food becomes even more important. And during the COVID situation, the early stages in the US and in Europe, there was some restrictions. And I believe that the US still has some restrictions on meat items. So I think it's a really interesting time to rethink how we see ourselves and see ourselves in line with nature and animals in general.
Right, and we talk about this idea of control in Stoicism, what's inside and outside of our control, and perhaps with these pandemic restrictions, we have more control over the situation as we're going to the grocery store more often rather than eating out. Of course, we're not traveling as much, so maybe easier in these times to have a healthier diet while, of course, not putting on some weight by just being home and not exercising, but that's a topic for another day. So yes, I've been able to make adjustments by going to my local grocery store. Usually breakfast is a vegan shake, as I have protein powder with greens combined with almond milk and oats and a banana. That's usually my breakfast. And for lunch and dinner, I have a rice cooker meal where I have different kinds of rice, jasmine rice, basmati rice, tofu, carrots, mushroom, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. I'll change the produce every so often, and it seems to be pretty easy for me to keep up with that by reducing or even eliminating animal products in my diet.
I think you're absolutely right. Because of this COVID situation, a lot of things that we took for granted, we no longer do so. And food was one of them, particularly early on when people decided to go crazy and buy all the toilet roll up as well as everything, I think.
Yes.
So I think the idea of being local as well has come at the forefront because we can no longer rely on these very complex food supply chains. So I think it should be at the forefront of people's mind. I know a lot of people who have been more interested in cooking because, they don't want to eat the same thing every day and used to go to, lunch out and now they cannot. But I do think that it is interesting that there is sort of this realization that perhaps, considering some of the theories behind why COVID happened in the first place, that our maltreatment of animals and nature generally, if not the primary cause, is certainly one of the secondary causes. Of course, we don't have all the evidence, but it certainly does seem to point that way, that if we are more careful about how we prepare our food, store our food, hunt for food, if we have to hunt, what kind of food we eat, that has all come to the forefront of this problem. That where does this come from? So it was very serendipitous for me in that sense that this has become an integral conversation. And it's not a very popular conversation because it's hard. I mean, people do feel that it's a very personal decision. Like, food is very personal. It's cultural. It can be political. Even Seneca became vegetarian and had to give it up for political reasons because his father was worried about the fact that vegetarianism was associated with non-Roman influences. So you can see there that even though he realized it was healthier for him and he says that he could think better, he ended up giving up to appease his father and to present as a good senator for Rome eventually. I imagine if he'd continued it, they would have doubted him as a senator, and they'd say he didn't have the public's best interest at heart. And you can still see this now. It's quite funny that when you cut down your meat consumption or you become vegetarian or vegan altogether, so you cut it out altogether, people then say, oh my gosh, where do you get your protein from? Oh my gosh, you're going to die. It's very hyperbolic, right? Just wanted to ask you, like, when you first started to cut down meat and then forgo it altogether, did people suddenly get worried about your health and never been worried before?
When I was making that transition, I was also exercising a lot more. That it wasn't just an eating thing; it was a focus on overall health. And I hope that you don't lose too much weight, or how do you get the protein, this and that. But adding some supplements, adding different foods, it's certainly not the case that it only comes from meat. But I guess people just have the ideas, or perhaps they're just interested in defending the position that they already have rather than taking the position of, what should I do, or looking into other approaches.
I was vegetarian before I became Stoic, but I wasn't vegan, but I've moved, not because I moved towards that direction. So I'm still pretty flexible with the vegetarian versus vegan diet, but I've decided, for example, as I claim to want animals to live according to nature, to decide, to say, well, milk is not a good example for me to use when people see me walking around with a milkshake with cow's milk, and I say, all animals should live according to nature, and then these cows are like shut in, they are restricted to from moving, from having any kind of good life, from whatever that means for a cow, but certainly doesn't mean being locked or caged or separated from their young so early on, to the point I've seen like cows who literally cannot. They have something around their neck, so they're not allowed to drink from their own mother, which causes a lot of stress. And then I realized that how can I say that we should live according to nature and then drink milk from a commercial farm, which doesn't care about a calf living according to her nature, nor the mother living according to her nature, and actually destroys the very bond that we say is integral to animal development, ochiosis. So we're basically destroying that bond of taking care of oneself and then taking care of others, right? So I just couldn't be a Stoic and then claim that we should all live according to nature and then go and do something that was so grievous indirectly to another sentient being. So I did reduce my milk intake, and as much as I can when I go to, say, drink a coffee, is to ask for either a black one or oat milk or a soy alternative. That was something that really shocked me. Mm-hmm. I was claiming one thing and then literally putting milk in my coffee. And it seemed so ridiculous that I would claim something and then do something that meant nothing, almost like this much milk, a very small amount of milk would mean absolutely nothing to me, and yet mean everything to a calf and her mother.
Right, so some adjustments there, and you're able to get those substitutions in pretty easily, especially if you're just drinking the coffee at home or preparing your own food. And on the go, at least here in the States, I can find almond milk in many places. Unfortunately, they'll charge for it. But in that case, if I don't want to pay, I can just say put Splenda in it and give it some flavor. So there are a lot of alternatives or substitutions there. So it doesn't seem to be the Herculean effort that some make it out to be. Oh, it's going to be impossible to avoid. Or as you talk about in the paper, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, especially when you're just starting out. You can make some gradual changes, right?
Yeah, I give this example, imagine I go to somebody's house and I know they're anti-vegan or anti-vegetarian and they offer me a tea, right? And I only drink tea black, but let's imagine that even that would offend them, right? They really want to give me the best tea in the world, and for them, that means like tea with just sugars and milk. I might say, well, yes, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt in their own house. So I might just drink the milk in the tea because I'm in their house. They're trying to be kind. They're pretty close-minded. Whatever I say is just going to cause an argument. And really, I'm just visiting them to make sure they're okay because they were quite lonely. For example, they're stuck in, they can't go out. So I just want to be like, how are you, neighbor? I'm so glad you're doing well. How's your daughter? I know she lives 300 kilometers away or 300 miles away. I'm just popping in to see if you need anything. What do you need? Oh, could you go and get me that milk when you go to the shops next week? I'm not going to go, you know what? No. I'm going to say, okay, of course I'll buy you the milk for you because that's what you need. And, oh, thank you so much. Here, have a cup of tea. I'm not going to turn around and go, well, thank you for your hospitality, but I don't agree with anything you just did there. I'm in their home. They're trying to be kind. And actually, by drinking the tea and then saying, like, oh, do you drink tea at home? Yeah, I do, but I drink it with oat milk. I can actually have a conversation about why I do that rather than just rejecting them as a human being. So one of the things in Stoicism is it depends always on the circumstance. The other circumstance I give, if I could eat a goat soup, for example, and prevent a tribal warfare, if they said, look, if you eat this soup, I promise that I will not attack the other group, then I should say, okay, if that is really what it takes to stop a war, that's what I'll do. And I've had plenty of examples where, personal ones, where my mum was really anti-vegetarian. She was really upset in the beginning. And so I said, look, Mum, I tell you what, there's only one meat that I'll eat. And she said, what is it? I said, your Sunday dinner, because I know you work really hard on it. I know it takes you 3.5 hours, and I'll eat that when I visit you 3 times a year. And then she changed literally overnight. She went out and bought me loads of vegetarian options and told my dad that I wasn't going to eat meat anymore, only her dinner. So she felt like it was really special mum. She always tells people my son's vegetarian, but he eats my dinner. So she completely changed from being really, she wasn't aggressive because my mum's not an aggressive person, but she was very upset. She actually felt that I didn't care about her anymore. And she took it really, really personally. Like, oh, you don't like our values and you don't care about our family time and things like that. She just went into this rejection must be a rejection of the family rather than a rejection of the meat. So once I just said, look, if it means eating, I said to myself, if it means eating meat 3 times a year, and suddenly, not causing a massive issue to my family and having my mum tell everyone that vegetarianism is fine, as long as, you have some kind of, love and attention to the Sunday dinner, then that's great. And so she's actually become more vegetarian herself, she says, because she doesn't feel that it's so aggressive, because she felt that vegans tend to be aggressive people in her mind, right? And some of them might be, but that was the kind of, she'll watch the news and that's the kind of thing that'll come up. It won't be the gentle vegan is being very kind to people. It'll be the vegan is very aggressive to people and attack somebody for some reason. So that's in my own life. And people who are very sort of less stoic in their vegan attitude might be like, no, you've sold yourself out. I have had that. I can't believe that you would just, you would accept that on those circumstances. That cow still had to suffer, and you're agreeing with that. But no, I'm not agreeing with that. But why? My mum is suffering, and I live in the real world, and I don't buy meat for myself. I wouldn't buy meat for somebody unless they couldn't go out to the supermarket and get themselves. But I always feel that if you want someone to be vegetarian or vegan, then cook them a vegan or vegetarian meal. That's the fastest way to make sure that they don't eat meat. It's not a case of virtue signaling or being very strong-handed with them and tell them that they want to be stoic, they must be more vegan or more vegetarian or transition. It's more like telling them, okay, here are the virtues. You said you want to live according to nature. You said that you value justice. You said you value self-control. Do you think that maybe eating less meat would be an example of self-control? Do you think that, being a little bit kinder when it comes to animal welfare would be linked to justice? Do you think it might be wise to consider strongly how we treat other animals? Do you think there might be wisdom in that? And then they can make their own decisions, because Stoicism is about asking other people questions and having a Socratic debate rather than telling somebody what they should do. And I'm hoping you have to tell me if that came across in the paper or not, because we were very strong not to say that veganism was stoic, because it's not.
Right. It's a question of how are you going to apply the virtues? How are you going to change your life? How can you benefit yourself? And just being mindful of, okay, what are the negatives? what are the positives rather than all Stoics must X, that's not going to be a great way to go about things. So just having more of an open inquiry about it and welcoming conversation, I think is good. And a lot of the benefits too. I think one thing you talked about is a lot of the standard American diet, some people refer to as SAD as the acronym is. It's a lot of food just pumped with sugars, a lot of unhealthy things, and especially on the extremes, if you're going to say talk about fast food, processed food, fried chicken, a lot of this stuff could just be tremendously unhealthy. So there can be some personal damage as well, not only talking about the community at large.
Exactly. I was going to ask you, what is it that you found most surprising in the paper? Because a lot of people said to me they found surprising that I didn't say we should be vegetarian, or I didn't say that we should be vegan. People felt that I was going to say that. But I shouldn't say I should say me and the co-authors. They really felt like we were going to say you should be vegetarian or you should be vegan, and we didn't. And they were like, you didn't say it. Did you find that surprising, or that we didn't say it, or you kind of, as you know me a little bit better than most people, that you weren't surprised at all by that nuance? Or what surprised you in the paper?
I wasn't expecting a definite conclusion of saying, oh, all people must do X. I didn't think that would happen in there, but it was interesting to read about some of the environmental issues, mainly dealing with water, not only just eating fish and some of the consequences that could come with that, but also how water is used to feed animals and how some of these habitats are destroyed by the overfishing and some of the impact there.
Absolutely. I think that people seem to just restrict, let's say, meat and fish to the direct animal rights issues, because animal rights is complicated in Stoicism. So what we try to do was say, actually, it's not only about that, it's also about the ecosystem. It's also about how we treat nature. So we gave the example of people tend to think only about the cow, not about the amount of water that is required to produce the hamburger. They tend to think about, again, how we treat the chickens, and if we just treat them better, it would be fine. But yeah, that may be true, but the amount of area that we need to allow chickens to run free as such, right, is so much more than if we just ate arable crops directly. So a lot of people again would say, yeah, but then you have the issue of soya, and vegans can eat soya, and soya destroys the rainforest, for example. And I'm saying, yes, it can do if you plant it in a poor location, but 70% of the soya that is consumed in the US is for beef, cattle, and pork farms. And that really stops the argument dead. It's because in order to decide whether something is a virtuous action or not, or at least allows us to progress towards virtue, one has to understand the facts. So yes, we do operate in that we as Stoics say that we should live according to nature, but if we don't know what the facts are, what does that mean? So let's say we have 7 billion to 8 billion people on the planet. Now, if we had 1 billion people on the planet, it would be a different argument, right? Because you wouldn't really necessarily have to argue the case about the land area. So you say, okay, but now we have 7 to 8 billion, then the amount of land that we require is even more than we would if we had 1 billion. And we need to give those animals more space than we suggested previously, because now we're saying that we don't want to put them in cages because they can't live according to nature, right? So the simple answer is not just to let them run free. If you then say, well, what about the wild animals? Because then you say, what about the wild animals? Now we've got all free and the chickens are running free, within reason. And now it's brilliant and they're all happy. And now we have no tigers, and we have no elephants, and we have no giraffes, and we have no, wild ferrets or voles or mice, because now all the cattle are running free. That's the other problem that people don't really think about. Like, okay, we'll just let them run free, then the issue is intensive farming, and that is one set of issues. But to then say, okay, so we let them all run free, and there's lots of cows, as we all know. Then what do we do with the wild animals? Do they have a right to live? Do they have a right to live according to their nature? Because if we let all these cows run free, the answer is they wouldn't be able to. So then you start to say, oh, this is problematic, because it's not just that I have to take care. I don't have an obligation only towards farm animals, but I have an obligation to all of nature, because I am rooted in the logocentric world viewpoint that says everything needs to live according to nature. And the way that I enact or act upon virtue is by understanding that. And even if I don't believe in the Stoic God, for example, I can still say, well, I still need to live according to those facts. And those facts dictate what is fair. Because again, if we only had 1 billion people on the planet, the amount of calories that we would need, even if we ate meat a lot, would be less than we do if we want to feed everyone with the same amount of beef. So this is the other issue, because people were saying to me, oh, well, what about those parts of land that, that you can't grow arable crops on? We can put cows there. I go, yeah, what about the animals that live there? Do they not have a right to live there? Because they can't live in the lowlands, because that's where we have the arable crops. But now you're telling me they can't live on the highland either, because now you want to have the cows there. So there's a balance there. So I try to tell people, okay, if you eat meat once a week or fish once a week, that's not a major issue. But the problem is most people don't eat it once a week. They eat this food once a day. And this is where you have to start saying, well, what does self-control mean? Does that make sense, Justin?
Right. And it's the demand from people, too, because if more people opted out, then there wouldn't be the demand for raising all these animals and all these factory farms and all of these scenarios. So if people were able to change their decisions there, then there wouldn't be as much destruction. Sometimes I hear, oh, well, it's just a drop in the bucket, right? Oh, if I opt out, what's that going to do? That's only one person. They're still doing it. As it doesn't really seem to be addressing the issues anyway when people give objections like that.
Absolutely. And then you say, well, we have a moral obligation. And again, I give an example, like imagine you're an American football fan and you're a Seattle fan, right? And number 12 is the fan. You never think, oh, what happens if I'm the only fan there? That never crosses your mind, right? You go because you think that, 60,000 fans will also join you, most of which will be on your side. You don't sit there and go, oh, maybe I don't go to the football match because I'm the only one who turns up. Oh, what would happen if I'm the only one? And then actually the irony is if you were the only one, you'd be the most important fan there because you'd be the only fan there. So you'd be the only fan cheering on. And actually your presence would be even more significant because it would provide an excellent example of how to be a fan, right? So people have this sort of attitude, but when you apply it to anything else, like what happens, when you go to work, you don't think, oh, what happens if the train doesn't run? Or what happens if my car doesn't start? You still get up and dressed. And then you go, wait a minute, my car isn't starting. And then you make decisions based on that. But before even people think about being vegetarian or vegan, they're like, no, it wouldn't make a difference. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Like, where is the step where you've made the effort? You've worked out like what the facts are. And you've realized that your moral integrity is not dependent on what other people do. I mean, oh my God, my Jacksonville Jaguar t-shirt on today, for example. There's not many fans of Jacksonville Jaguars. There's only about 800,000 people in Jacksonville, and they probably support Miami Dolphins. They used to in the 80s. And just because my team is bad doesn't mean I stop supporting them. If I'm a true fan, even if they're awful, which they've been awful of late, I still care, within the framework of, okay, this is a sport that I like. So even if nobody else were vegetarian or vegan, and it was just me and you, it doesn't mean that it's not valid from a moral perspective. If I have integrity as a Jacksonville Jaguar fan, I don't walk around with now it's a Las Vegas Raiders shirt on because they happen to be winning, or a Kansas City shirt. I don't change because it's convenient to me because I want to look like a winner. It's more like what's important to me, what do I value, and where is my path towards eudaimonia? And I would say that eating, according to Musonius Rufus, is an integral part to eudaimonia, because he would say, how can you make poor decisions 3 times a day about what you eat? The irony is all the things that we can control, food is one of them, because it's, as an adult, I would definitely say, as a child, difficult. You choose what you cook, you choose what you put in your mouth, you choose within a range, because there's some things you like and some things you don't like. You choose for the most part what you do within certain restrictions. People say, okay, what happens if I'm allergic to all vegetables, right? I only know one case of a person who was literally, all they could eat was meat and mushrooms. They were literally allergic to vegetables. And their parents were really upset because they were vegetarian. And this person had basically ate meat once a day in the morning and ate nothing else. He couldn't even drink like milk, like he drank milk and like water and stuff. He couldn't even have like an orange juice or anything. And that's the only person that I've ever met or met the parents of that had that situation. And I said, what does that mean for him? He said, can't go out, can't go to the restaurants, can't do anything, can't be contaminated. He's literally at home eating this meat in the morning and he can't really eat anything else. So in his case, should he be vegetarian? Well, absolutely not. He would die. So he's not got a moral obligation because he has no alternative. So I try to show people stoicism about when you have different choices and then you make choices according to your desire to live according to nature, to live according to the virtues that you want to make manifest in your life. If you have no choice because you have no money and you eat what you're given because you went to a soup kitchen, there's no moral obligation on you. We always go to the extreme. What happens if I was in that situation If you were in that situation, I'm sure you'd eat a chicken soup if you have nothing else to eat. But that's not, Stoicism doesn't say that, okay, just because you have to eat a chicken soup because that's all you've got, that you're morally a bad person. No, it does say that if you have choices and you know facts and you live according to facts and according to nature, then perhaps this is not the best route.
Right. It's when we have the choices that's where morality really comes in. No one's going to be upset with prisoners for failing to donate to charitable organizations if they don't have the money and they're in jail, or, the lion kills the gazelle. Are people going to say, oh, you're a terrible lion, how could you do something like that? Because we don't think that choice is there. But for us, well, if we have the reasonable amount of money, we have the means to do this and make some changes, then that seems to be a better way to go forward. And it doesn't always have to be very expensive either. I mean, maybe if you're going to buy these really expensive meat substitutes and you're going to buy this specialty food, okay, well, maybe the gluten-free section's going to be more expensive than the other ones, for example, and some people might not be able to afford that. But there might even be inconsistencies there where some people are spending a lot of money eating out, and instead they could save some of that money, they could budget, they can figure it out, or find some other ways to save, I would think, in many circumstances.
I mean, absolutely. As a student, I remember, I'm talking now a while back more than 10 years ago now, people say, how comes you can afford organic? You're a student, so I don't drink alcohol. And you can imagine how much students spend on alcohol, right? So I said, if you take what you spend on alcohol a week and you remove that because you no longer drink, then that extra £20 was in the UK would actually give you the organic food that I'm eating. And they were like, oh yeah. So it's just a question of priorities, and Stoicism is about questioning what are my priorities and why are they my priorities, because it's not enough to just know what those priorities are. So a principle is only a principle when it costs you, right? It's easy because let's say Burger King has made it easy for you because they've offered you a vegan burger, right? It's much more difficult when you are saying, oh, I have to buy a pressure cooker and I have to cook beans because I can't afford to buy the bean cans because that's expensive, but I can buy a whole, dry beans and use a pressure cooker. I have to learn that. And I have to make, quote unquote, sacrifices. It's a lot easier when somebody makes decisions for you. But Stoicism isn't about having the easy route always. Now, it can be, because there's nothing wrong with the easy route if that aligns well with living according to nature and working towards eudaimonia. But nothing in Stoicism is supposed to be easy just because it's the right thing to do. On the contrary, normally things that are the right thing to do are difficult because there's always a company that's willing to sell you more processed food at a cheaper price than a nice fresh lettuce that's organic, that has really grown slowly and respected the soil and respected the other animals, so there's not pesticides everywhere that's killing lots of insects and therefore lots of birds who then eat the insects that are contaminated. It's a lot more difficult to put that effort in to grow that lettuce than just spray everything. Now that's a challenge because does it mean that organic is the solution? And we said in the paper, it depends, right? You don't just, if you're eating organic to prove a point to your neighbors that you have more money than them, then eating organic is actually vicious, right? In that example, because your intention is just to show off. You're not doing it because you care about the birds. You're doing it because you care about what your neighbors think of you. So again, Stoicism always asks you to peel back that layer to really look at your decision, why you're doing something. And people said to me, but that's exhausting. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions because it's easy. They say it's a really broad way to go down. I don't use the word using hell, but let's go with it. It's easy to fall into hell. It's easy to backslide. A lot of Christians would use that terminology. And it's a lot harder to navigate, a tough path, a path that's not laid out for you easily, that you have to search for. Because eudaimonia is not an easy path. It's something that you and I have to search for. No eudaimonia just appears and you just follow the masses. And so it was always like that. In fact, there's an action joke where they said Zeno is excellent because he teaches hunger and he still gets students. And I think that's really interesting, that especially in the Roman period with the elite, where they were about eating and then throwing it back up. So you could even say that Romans found that really interesting, that Zeno, people would preach hunger and still have students. But people forget about this in Stoicism, that food is so fundamental to Stoicism because it comes from the Cynic background where food isn't the be all and end all. Whereas in the Roman situation, which is why Marcus says, remember that a fish is just a dead fish, it's just a dead animal, even though it looks good. And that's why he's reminding that, because of the whole sort of frivolous and very sort of ostentatious way of looking at food. And he's reminding himself this is just a dead bird. Whereas in the Hellenistic period, back when Zeno's around, it's quite popular to be a cynic and restricts your food to what is strictly necessary. So it's quite interesting that Stoicism has these sort of two extremes, like the very elite of the elite to, a failed merchant who adopts a philosophy that says that we don't really need material wealth at all. So I found that interesting, and that's why I find it very surprising that there was so much pushback in the general public towards these ideas of being a little bit more thrifty and being a little bit more considerate. I was very surprised by that. Why do you think there is so much pushback when it comes to having a vegetarian or vegan diet?
Yeah, I hear a lot of pushback. It's about, oh, well, meat tastes so good, I wouldn't want to give it up. Or, oh, well, that's just what I've always done. It would just be such a big change. Or they don't see that the impact is there. It's like, well, is eating really all about the taste? And can't you just get the good taste from something else anyway? At least I'll use different flavors, different sauces, and maybe ultimately the thing is, well, maybe we can have fun and joy and all this other stuff in other areas of life that is just not food. I mean, are people really saying, oh my gosh, oh, that tastes so good, and they're eating it, and maybe it's like a 15 or 20 minute ordeal, and like an hour later maybe they're still hungry or they're bloated or whatever happens to be the case. Maybe it's that people are thinking of the moment and not so much about the future, not so much about the consequences, not so much about the long term. And it's interesting because I often hear a correlation where people are talking about, oh, I like this, I like that. They spend all this money and then they don't have money. And then they're stressing about, oh, how am I going to pay the bills? What am I going to do next? And the YOLO lifestyle, right? It doesn't seem to be so great. It doesn't seem to be as good as it's cracked up to be, where instead, if people can be more frugal, they can be more mindful of the situation and think more of the long term and find that joy in just not having to worry about so much and having that independence rather than just being dependent on other things. How many people I hear, they're saying, oh, well, I don't like my job, I don't like what I'm doing, I don't like my area in life, and they feel that they're just stuck because they're in this position, they're doing the same things over and over again, and they're not improving. They've given up. Maybe there can be a learned helplessness in some cases there. They think that they can't improve their position, but there are many passages in the Stoic text that talks about making gradual improvement and just trying to have some goals and moving toward them to find a better station in life.
I think you're absolutely right. I find actually it's interesting you say about pleasure, because it's not a very popular example, but I give an example. Imagine I really like to have sex with animals, and it gives me immense pleasure. But no, if I said that out loud and actually meant that I did that, people would be horrified. But it gives me so much pleasure. Like, it gives me 20 minutes of pleasure every time I have sex with this animal. You wouldn't believe the pleasure that I have. You should try it. Like, you're missing out. Like, really, you don't know what you're doing. Like, this animal, it's just amazing. Like, I don't know why you can't see that. Obviously, I mean, it's just natural. I mean, our ancestors did it. So what is the issue? Like, what is the problem? If I do it, I'm not causing anybody else any problem. It's, it's crazy. And the funny thing, or the weirdest thing is that there may be some pleasure that one poor animal gets. Right? If you kill the animal, what pleasure can that animal get? None. It's absurd that we are so much about pleasure. But if I gave the example that I just gave, people would be horrified. But I just use the same reason that they give me about why they eat meat. Oh, I really like it. I couldn't give it up. It's too nice. But if I gave the same example about that particular individual animal, they'd be like, you should be in prison. Why should I be in prison for giving, doing this particular action to an animal, which doesn't kill it, which doesn't torture it in the same way as I have an animal, I put it in a very restricted space. I restrict this animal from having any natural interaction with their calf. I then breed them over and over again until they're exhausted, and then I sell their carcass off for cat food, for example. And I find that ludicrous that people would be more offended by the fact that I would, have my favorite animal that I would love entirely, and I would, take them for walks, and they'd have loads of space, and they might even have puppies that I then give to family members. They would find that more atrocious because there's this cognitive dissonance that happens. There's this taboo of, and I I'm not saying for one instant that we should open this taboo up. No, it's a good reason that we don't do this. And I think it's completely wrong that I would have my favorite animal and do the action. But equally, I see it actually just as wrong, or if not more wrong, to the animal to kill it, to torture it throughout its entire life and kill it. And this is the cognitive dissonance, that we can have this pleasure argument, but if I have this argument with you about how much I like to spend time with my animal for the pleasure, it brings me sexually, that's an offence. That's a go to prison, or at least have no friends and be ostracized for the rest of your life. And I think if people understood it like that this pleasure argument is actually, it's flawed, then they would stop using it. And I'd say, okay, even if you got immense pleasure of it, you really have to justify it because you're killing an animal. The same way, if I said, oh, I can't free my slave because they're such a good chef, the amount of pleasure that this slave brings me when they cook my favorite vegetarian lasagna, you'd say, hang on a minute, you're prioritizing your taste buds over the freedom of someone you've enslaved. And nobody, or very few people in this world would agree with me if I claim that my lasagna was more important than the freedom of the slave. And very few would agree with me that I should be able to have pleasure with a particular animal as long as I look after the animal in every other aspect. No one would agree with me, but yet we have this multi-billion industry that just sends cows, chickens, pigs, some goats to torturous conditions, concentration camps really, and just uses them and doesn't see any value in them at all. And Stoics would say, and so would Aristotle, that because we are, one step up on the ladder, we have the obligation they don't have. It's actually the other way around, that we are so sentient and we are able to make these choices, that we should not lower ourselves to say, well, we're like lions, we have no choice, we have to eat meat. To say, actually, we do have choices. To me, it's the complete opposite, that our humanity enables us to distinguish between what is absolutely necessary from a health perspective and what is a taste bud preference. We can do that. A cat can't do that. And yet when we have the opportunity to really look and reshape our food industry, we always fall down to the lowest bar, the lowest denominator, where a lion eats meat and no one criticizes that lion. And I would say, yeah, lions also rape and kill all the offspring of previous lions. If we want to use a lion argument, then we should use it consistently. And then people were like, oh my gosh, that's awful. And we're just inconsistent. It's this one taboo that we're consistently up against. And I think if we eat meat once a week, that would diminish substantially this issue, because I think the animals could roam free, and they could, if we drank milk only, say, once a week, they could give milk to their calf, because you wouldn't be restricting it to the extent that we are. That's why I don't think that vegetarian and veganism is the Stoic diet. I think certainly restriction of meat and milk so that it's fair to everybody involved is Stoicism in practice.
Yeah, it seems that the pleasure distinction is pretty arbitrary, that, you could have it in one place, but not in others. And yeah, maybe it's a lot of taboo that people wouldn't say in some area, well, hey, I can buy meat at the grocery store, but yet if my dog dies, then I wouldn't eat it. People wouldn't go about that. So maybe they would say, oh, well, there's that connection there that I've formed, that I would just feel really weird about it, so I wouldn't do it. So maybe if you don't know the animal, it's out of sight, out of mind. Maybe that's the reasons that some people are giving here, along with the tradition, or just not really caring, or thinking that it's the biggest deal. And I find that it's become easier over time too, especially when traveling, especially when not at home, to find substitutions. Even when I was in Las Vegas before the pandemic, I went to many restaurants there and they just had a vegetarian menu and a vegan menu, or different areas. I was at Cheesecake Factory a few weeks ago and they had vegan salads that were there, and many other Impossible Burger, other options like that. So it seems like restaurants, it seems like the rest of the world is gradually moving toward that. And maybe because it's cheaper for them to produce this, maybe because there's the demand, maybe there's a list of factors coming together where they want to do that, to give people some more options for their diets, more options for eating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that concerns me about like these vegan burgers is that it basically cuts out the middleman. So you also have this question whether you you want to eat, say, vegan burgers every day when basically the wealthier are getting even wealthier. And that's the biggest challenge, to show people the reason why you don't know about these animal welfare issues is because up until now, there was no money involved in making a vegan burger, because it was very much more like what they might call quote unquote hippie. And now it's more a lab-based thing, so that people like Leonardo DiCaprio have the money and investing in it. Bill Gates is investing in it. So there's now this sort of almost vested interest in now highlighting these animal welfare issues. So Stoicism calls you to dig deeper and ask, why aren't these questions being raised? The only reason that we are, is out of sight, out of mind, is because the companies such as Tyson Food, they don't want you to know that they have a monopoly over all the chicken. They don't want you to know how people are being treated. And that's one thing that COVID has highlighted in the US, at least, about the way that meat is prepared. A lot of people become sick, right? There's been states where the entire COVID issue is linked to one processing plant. And normally those people are immigrants, so they're frightened to speak out. Some of them illegal immigrants, so extremely frightened to speak out. So I think COVID has shown like the nature of the supply chain, and the fact, for example, that legally it was more about reopening the plants to protect, say, vested interest and monetary interest than protecting the health of people. Now, that's a different argument, but I do think it means that we need to consider, why don't we know this? I think people do care. I think they would switch off. But if they saw reality, if it was presented to them in a factual way, I think most people would say, maybe I should be vegetarian, because when I've asked people, would you kill a cow to eat it? They'd be like, no, I'd be vegetarian if I had to kill it myself. So I think it's just one step further along, going, okay, so if you know how they're being treated, would it make a difference to you? I think most people would say yes. And I think people in the West are waking up, because it's no longer linked to a status issue. Whereas, for example, in China, I used to live there. I asked people what they wanted to be when they're older, and they said fat, which made me laugh. And I said, why do you want to be fat? And they said, because then it looks like I have money. More men than women, and they could be more choosy. So women's parents tend to say, pick a person who has money. So people said, I want to be fat because it shows I have money. So there's one kid who was eating KFC every day, literally every day during the summer, so he could look a bit fat. Because being thin in certain places in China means that you're poor. And this is the only thing that I'm concerned about. That whilst in the West we're starting to say, well, eating meat is not a status thing, because it had been before. It's only the elite that ate meat every day. Now it's almost the other way around. That it's an elite thing to be like, I don't know, living in Austin, Texas, and having an Impossible Burger, right? Again, Stoics can't be tricked into these social status things, or shouldn't be tricked into. They could be, they shouldn't be. And politically, they should also think, why don't I know this information? Whose interest is it? Why suddenly, now that we can sell vegan burgers for a lot of money, because you and I know they're very expensive, why now is the animal welfare issue becoming one? So Stoics, again, it asks you to peel back the layer, to ask yourself questions that other people may not be asking.
Right, and now I'm seeing the marketing has shifted too, especially with Beyond Burger I've seen here in the United States, where they're marketing as, look, it tastes the same, and I've seen the price comparable in many places too. Atlantic City, one option. Some casinos will have restaurants like Bill's Burger, or it was AC Burger Company, where they'll just give you the option, and it's not much more expensive or very similar price. So some places are doing better about it, rather than going to Dunkin' Donuts and they're going to charge you 75 cents extra for the almond milk. It seems to be outrageous there, as there's some incentive there. So I think some of the marketing is changing there. Some people are saying, hey, if it tastes the same and I don't know the difference, then I'll go with that. That's not a problem. So maybe some people are moving towards that, because if it's super bland, then maybe people will just opt out and, that's too much of an inconvenience for me. So maybe there's some progress.
I agree. I do say to Stoics, or people that want to practice Stoicism, if you do it just because it's easy and convenient, you're not really engaging with there's no virtue there. Right, easy and convenient doesn't necessarily. It's basically you're aligned by accident. You're like the fool who by accident does the right thing but has no idea what they're doing. So that doesn't make you less foolish to do the right thing because it's now easier. Now the fact that it makes it more easier means that you have even greater obligations. So whereas like 10 years ago you could say, well, I don't know a vegan restaurant, or I don't have a vegan option, there's nothing I can do. Your obligation is greater, but your walk towards virtue is not linked to how easy or difficult something is. I did everything I could. I made the biggest effort I could, and yet there was literally, when I was in Cuba, for example, it was very difficult to be vegetarian, and I did it, but it was very, very hard because I decided I would live the Cuban lifestyle for 2 weeks. So I didn't go to like a tourist area where the food was plenty. I basically lived like a Cuban for 2 weeks, and it was really, really difficult because you'd say, well, what options do you have? And it was just like, oh, we have one vegetable we could put on your pizza. Okay, what's that? Pepper. I was like, oh, I have a pepper pizza. So even in that case, where it was very, very difficult to be vegetarian in Cuba, I did it because I thought a principle is a principle, right? If it doesn't cost you, then you don't really know it's a principle. It's just convenience. So again, I encourage Stoics, yes, if it's convenient, then to do it, but to remember that virtue isn't built on convenience. Virtue is built on coherent and consistent decisions to do the right thing because you have the facts. Now, I just want to make one caveat. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to do all the research that I did, right, to make a decision. That's why I present it with my co-authors in that paper, so that you don't have to do the hours and hours of work. But now there's almost like no excuse for Stoics to go, well, I have no idea what the contemporary Stoic diet might be according to facts. That's the other reason that we wrote it, to put it all together. So like, you yourself had all the evidence that we provided to say, okay, I am vegan, and now I know the more, why I might choose to go that way. So it's not about finding all the answers, but finding out who you can trust. So in terms of health, I would say like Dr. Michael Greger, How Not to Die, very good book. Most vegans have read it, and it would encourage me to continue to be vegetarian for health reasons. But I didn't write the health paper because I'm not an expert. I'm not a medical doctor. So I don't know the best course of action on my background is environmental. But I wanted to tie that together because a lot of times we just talk about health, but we don't talk about the health of the planet. And when we put an extra circle of concern to include the environment, I think it's inherently obvious that health isn't just restricted to us or our family, but the wider world.
Good. So we're coming up on time here. How can people find you online? How can people find your paper? I'll link it in the show notes, some information, but for those just listening, how can they find you?
And I think the best way is at Kai Whiting on Twitter or stoickai.com. And if
you could spell that?
Stoic, STOIC, Stoic Kai, KAI. Stoickai.com. I read all my emails and reply to all of them, even if they're slightly rude. So please try not to be rude, but yeah, I will reply to you even if you are rude, because I think that engagement happens when we find the common ground. So again, I'm not saying anyone should be something, but certainly questioning is Stoic. And then those questions and the answers you subsequently give should lead you to a diet that you feel helps you move towards eudaimonia. So the challenge here is not to eat a certain way, but to certainly ask certain questions that you come to your own conclusions.
Good. And that's How Might a Stoic Eat in Accordance with Nature and Environmental Facts.
Thank you, Justin, for having me.
All right. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more content. Visit my website at stoicsolutionspodcast.com for past episodes and social media links. Support my efforts through Patreon, linked on my website, to receive special perks, including having upcoming podcast guests answer your questions, custom-made podcast episodes, and private one-on-one calls to discuss whatever you'd like. Visit my other podcast at hurdygurdytravel.com, that's HURDYGURDY, hurdygurdytravel.com, to learn how to make money, save money, and travel the world at next to no cost with credit card rewards, deals, and loyalty programs. Thanks to John Bartmann, who offered free consultation and audio edits for episodes 51 through 63. Thanks to Phil Giordana from the symphonic metal group Fairyland, whose music was included in past episodes, but now removed because YouTube has been flagging my videos with copyright claims, even though Phil agreed to share the music. Thanks to generous patrons and fans of this podcast who help support my work. Have a great day.